Hi everyone, welcome back to Attacking and Defending Active Directory. In this video, we are going to continue our discussion with persistence mechanisms once we have the domain admin privileges. Let's discuss about DSRM. What is DSRM? DSRM is Directory Services Restore Mode, the safe mode for any domain controller. Those of you who have set up or promoted a machine to the domain controller role would know that this is what the DSRM uh, password looks like, right? So what is this DSRM password? This password is assigned to a local administrator onto the domain controller. It's not the RID 500 domain administrator, but there is a local user called administrator on every domain controller to which this DSRM password is assigned. Now, as we saw in case of you're using a GUI, the DSRM password is asked like this. In case of you're using a script, it is called the safe mode password. Once again, why it is used when a domain controller needs to be rebooted in the safe mode, right? So how we can abuse it? We can, if we have domain admin privileges, we can change the logon behavior of this particular user called administrator and can remotely log on or over the network log on to the domain controller as an administrator. So a couple of things to keep in mind. One is by default, this has been a known issue. So by default, the DSRM administrator or this administrator is not allowed to log on over the network onto the DC. That is one. Secondly, uh, what would be the persistence time, right? How long can we persist or we can hold on to our privileges if we abuse this functionality? The answer is possibly very, very long. I think even longer than the golden ticket attack. Why? Because I always like to joke this that the guy who know the DSRM password is probably already dead, right? Once again, the DSRM password is set when the domain control is promoted, and this is once again generally done not at least not every day or every month or even every year, right? So the persistence life is quite long. If you know the DSRM password, no one actually cares about the DSRM password. Many security professionals are not even aware of anything like DSRM administrator or DSRM password. Uh, Once again, because it is not used in the day-to-day operations of domain administrators, the password may not be known even to the domain administrators of a domain. So this means that if you have access to the DSRM password or the TLM hash of the DSRM, you may not, you may have the persistence lifetime to be really, really long in a domain or for a domain controller, right? So that is what DSRM is. Now, how do we compare this with the domain admin administrator? So let's extract the credentials once again from the domain controller and compare them. Here you can see that the second command is the one which we used for while discussing golden ticket and silver ticket attacks as well. This provides us the credentials from the LSS process, and here we are extracting credentials from the SAM hive, which contains information only about the local users, right? So if let's compare the credentials if we can. So let me run this. So here, if I copy the NTLM hash of the administrator user, it is this. This is the NTLM hash of the administrator user in our current domain, in our target domain. And in place of this, if I use this command, let me copy that to avoid any typos. If I use this particular command here, that is specifically ask for the local users onto the domain controller. Here you can see that this is the DSRM administrator here. So if we compare the credentials of both of these users, the second one is the DSRM. It is clearly observable that these two users are different ones. So once we have these credentials, once again, we are talking about persistence. So we already have domain admin privileges. We are just looking at the ways of holding on to those privileges. Uh, excuse me. Now, because this is a local administrator onto the DC or DSRM administrator, we can authenticate to the DC using this, but we need to change the logon behavior for this account before we can uh, authenticate to the DC or access DC using these credentials from the network. So right now we still have our domain admin privileges from previous method. So what we need to do is simply change this particular registry key into the domain controller. Let's do that. So here where we have the domain admin privileges, I change this. Okay, the property already exists. So if I run a get item property here, the DSRM logon behavior is set to 0. So we need to set item property here, name DSRM logon behavior, value set to 2. So let's run this. Right, and if I once again have a look at it, so the logon behavior has been changed to 2 now. What does that mean? That means that what we have the hash of the DSRM administrator, and we have changed its logon type. Now this was with our current DA privileges. Now later on, few months later, we can come back and run this command to get our domain admin privileges back, right? So this was us, let's say 6 months back, and this is us right now, right? That is, we extracted the NTLM hash, changed the logon behavior. Now 6 months later, we would like to get those privileges back. So let's run this one. I hope the hash is correct. Yes, it is. So what we are doing now we are okay, this needs to be executed as a local administrator. So but let's try to use enter ps session, computer name dcor dc. Okay, local. Okay, probably this. All right. So there we were forcing the Kerberos authentication. Probably that is why that was not possible to do, right? So here we can see that what we did was to authenticate to the domain controller using its DSRM administrator hash, and now we can access it as the local admin. One thing you may like to keep in mind here in the domain part, we are using the domain controller name, not the current domain, right? So please keep that in mind. So this is the abuse of the DSRM administrator functionality or behavior. Right, this brings us to our next learning objective. Use domain admin privileges obtained earlier to abuse the DSRM credential for persistence. Now, you may like to note that some of these persistence techniques are, for example, skeleton key and this are uh, can be very, if used carelessly, then they can be something which downgrades the security of the target organization. So, like skeleton key, if you are actually going to use the DSRM administrator or abuse DSRM administrator in a real world assessment, make sure that you talk to the stakeholders and get their permission, right? Specifically because of this thing, here we are actually downgrading the security of the domain controller by reintroducing something which has been fixed. Or in fact, we are introducing a vulnerability here, right? So please keep in mind that this thing is something which introduces a new risk in the target environment. So make sure that you discuss this with your client or your organization and test this in a very controlled environment, right? So this was about the DSRM. Another interesting persistence technique is to use your own SSP. Once again, we are going to use an SSP from Mimikatz. What is an SSP? A SSP is a security support provider. It is a DLL which provides ways for an application in the domain to obtain an authenticated connection. That is, it provides authentication services. Some well-known SSP packages written by Microsoft, which you may be aware are NTLM, Kerberos, WDigest, CRED SSP, right? Mimikatz has its own SSP. If you want, we can use that. That is called Mimilib, that is inside mimilib.dll. Now, this SSP has the capability to log local logons, service account, and machine account passwords in clear text on the target server or the domain controller, right? Which makes it very, very interesting to use. We can use, so the idea is clear, right? Because SSPs are DLLs, we can implement our own DLL from Mimikatz, which does interesting stuff for us. The normal authentication still works when this is implemented, but what we get is the all the local logons, interactive logons, passwords for service accounts, machine account passwords, etc., are logged in clear text onto the target server. How do we implement it? There are two ways of using it. One is we pick up mimilib.dll from the Mimikatz repository, drop it to the system32 directory of the domain controller, and add mimilib to this registry key. A sample PowerShell code which we can use to add mimilib to as an SSP is this. We need to uh, add mimilib to the HKLM system current control set control LSA OS config and HKLM system current control set control LSA. We add mimilib to both the package, both the registry keys, drop the DLL inside system32 and reboot the machine. Once the machine is rebooted, we will have a log on or a log of all the local logons and service account passwords, etc., in the system32 kvssp.log directory, now the kvssp.log file, right? So an easy way, not if easy, an interesting way to get credentials of domain admins in clear text. Another method is to inject into LSS. We can simply use invoke mimikatz dash command miscellaneous mem ssp onto the domain controller, and we should get the same results without a reboot. In my experiments, I did not find it very stable with Server 2016. That is, it was not stable. Not stable means I would find it that sometimes it would work, sometimes it would not work. There was no stable pattern. I tested it on my own lab in that is the labs which I have on my laptop on my own servers, and also on Amazon. In some cases it would work on some of the machines, in other cases it would not. So if you want, feel free to try it. This is the second way. Another interesting thing when we talk about this logs, you can actually modify mimilib.dll to uh, create this log file into sysvol or netlogon directory. Sysvol is the directory which is accessible by any user or any machine in the domain. So we can actually create this file there. We can modify the Mimicat source code for that and create that file there so that we can actually read this without having domain admin privileges later on. Once again, please keep in mind that if you are writing this log file into a world readable directory in the domain, please consider the risks you introduce before actually going ahead and using this in a real operation. Right? So please keep that in mind. So this was about another persistence technique. There is no learning objective or hands-on where I direct you to run this. Feel free to try it in the labs. I'm not going to show you a demonstration of this. I consider this to be a bit more risky and noisy to be usable in an actual assessment. But your mileage may vary, your implementations may be different. So feel free to try this in the labs. So that would be all for this video. We'll continue our discussion with persistence in the next videos. Hope you like the video. Thank you very much for watching.